Hello, welcome to our 9th lesson in our series on Judaism, beliefs and teachings. This lesson is all about the mitzvot and free will, what the relationship is between the commandments set by God and the free will that God has given humans. Today we've got two objectives. Firstly, to understand the relationship between mitzvot and free will. Secondly, to understand how the mitzvot are interpreted by Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. Now, what do you need to know today? You need to know this: that God has given Jews the mitzvot, so they know how to use their God-given free will. Hence, there are rewards and punishments. Now, if you've watched the previous lessons, then this word mitzvot will not be a new word to you. It simply means the commandments given by God. That's what the mitzvot are. In the last lesson, we learned that there's 613 mitzvot, 613 commandments, and they can be divided up in a whole different bunch of ways. If you haven't seen it, click the link to see that video. We also know that the mitzvot is incredibly important in Judaism because it's part of the covenant that Moses made with God at Mount Sinai when God had rescued the Israelites from Egypt and brought them to the mountain. They set this agreement up, this special covenant, where the Jews would be God's chosen priesthood people who would be free from slavery, and in response they would follow the mitzvot, the 613 commandments. This lesson is all about how mitzvot and free will work together. So what is free will? Well, simply put, free will is the belief that God has given us all the responsibility and the ability to make our own moral decisions. He's enabled us to be able to choose what we think is right from wrong in different circumstances, and then the responsibility that goes with that our actions will have consequence. So, key question: how can God give us free will and commandments? How is that possible? What's the relationship there? Is it possible for God to say, you have the responsibility and the ability to make your own decisions. This is how I want you to live? Some people would say that's a contradiction, but actually I think, of course, that's possible. Have a look at this slide here. You can see that there are 7 doors available, but one is yellow. The purpose of this image, for the sake of this lesson, is to get you thinking that yes, we have the free will to make our own moral decisions, to go where we want to go, but actually there is a particular way that God wants us to go. That's a Jewish belief that the mitzvot show you how to use your free will. The mitzvot are a guideline to live in a great life full of great decisions. In our previous lesson on JB3 Jewish Beliefs and Teachings number 3, if you want to click the link to see that one, we see that God rewards and punishes people for their actions. And there's examples of this all through the Tanakh. The ones we talked about were Adam and Eve and their banishment from the Garden of Eden. We talked about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we talked about flooding the earth, where God rescued Noah and his family. Now, if there are rewards and punishments from God, then it makes sense that we have free will. If we didn't have free will, then why would we be rewarded or punished for the choices we've made? But no, free will is a very important decision in Judaism, and it's all about this idea that we have the ability and the responsibility to make our own moral decisions. To go further and explore this idea about the commandments that God has given us and the free will that He's given us further, it might be interesting to look at a couple of commandments that you might have to use your free will to break or to interpret in a certain circumstance. So, for example, for many Jews, if someone was coming to kill them and they in turn killed that person in self-defense, that would be acceptable even though it goes against one of the 10 commandments, do not kill. And so this is an example of the free will being used in relationship with the commandments given by God. Another helpful way to look at this, and another good thing to think about when we're thinking about free will, is that ultimately God's in control. God's in charge. We know from an earlier lesson that He's the creator, He's the sustainer, and that everything comes from God. So we can use our free will, but actually the consequences are in God's hands. When we're using free will, we're a bit like a farmer who sows some seeds. We can sow the seeds and we can water it, but it's actually God who makes any plants grow. And this is a bit like our free will. We can use our free will to make certain decisions, but ultimately everything that happens is part of God's decisions, and He has the final say. All of us know from our experience of life so far that we've always got choices, we've always got options. And those choices, those options have different consequences and repercussions. So the way we choose to go is going to have an effect on us and others, etc. Here's a helpful picture. We've got two options here, an apple or a donut. A lot of us in these positions know exactly the consequences that would come from eating either one, but still we often might choose something that's not good for us. And that's helpful when we're thinking about free will and mitzvot as well. That when God actually gave Moses the mitzvot, he was aware. God says that he knows that not everyone is going to follow the mitzvot, even though it's the best thing for them. And you may in your own life have experiences and memories of times where you were offered something good, but you chose something bad, or you went down a route knowing that it wasn't going to be the best thing for you. And that's part of our human nature. But that's all part of this concept of free will, that we have the ability and responsibility to make our own moral decisions. In a previous lesson, we saw this really helpful verse in Deuteronomy, which kind of talks about this idea. In it, this is Moses talking to God's people about God's law, God's commandments, God's mitzvot. And he says, "See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I'm giving you today, or the curse, if you disobey the commandments of the Lord your God and turn from the way that I command you today." You see, following the mitzvot, Jews believe leads to a great life and a harmonious society. And Jews also believe that we're going to be judged fairly on how we've made our decisions in life and what actions we've taken. So let's pause here and have a go at some questions. 4 questions and an extension. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we can look at some answers. Okay, how did you get on with that? Let's check your understanding. Number 1, explain what is meant by free will. Well, hopefully you heard me say it enough times, but free will means that God has given us the ability and the responsibility to make our own moral decisions. Number 2, under what circumstances could a Jew break a mitzvah using their free will? Well, the one we spoke about was to kill in self-defense. They'd be going against do not kill, but it would be for a good reason. We're going to look more about this in a few lessons' time when we look at the idea of pekuat nefesh, which means that you can break the mitzvah in order to save a life. Number 3, explain the connection between God's punishments and blessing and human free will. So what is the connection here? Well, the connection is that we do have free will. We can make our own decisions, but God will bless us or curse us by the consequences that come out of making those decisions. Also, God's blessings and punishments are a reminder that we do have free will, because if we didn't have free will, then God wouldn't be able to bless us or punish us for our actions, because we would have had no control over them. Number 4, the world would be a better place if there was no free will. Do you agree? Explain your answer. Well, obviously this is down to your opinion. For me personally, I think free will is a fantastic thing. We'd be robots without it. Life would be boring and mundane. We wouldn't have any freedom of expression. On the other hand, free will puts us a bit in danger. It means that we're able to hurt each other and be hurt by others. And so you can see that there are two different sides of the same coin, pros and cons. And then extension there, think of a time when you last broke a rule. What happened? What was the outcome? That was a deeply personal question, I know, and hopefully you had a good think about that for yourself. I myself have never broken a rule, so it's not something that I could consider. Now, previously in the first lesson, and we've gone back to this idea a few times, you should be aware now that in Judaism, there's not just one big group of Jews who all think the same thing. There's lots of different groups of Jews. And the two we focus on most often in these lessons are Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. And we mentioned this last lesson, but both groups have different interpretations of the law. Now, for example, Orthodox Jews generally, especially ultra-Orthodox Jews, want to follow the mitzvot as to the letter as possible. And so they want to ensure they understand all 613 rules and they're daily trying to apply these rules in their life. This is very different to Reform Jews. Now, Reform Jews, they believe that God's word fits the context that they are in. And so what they would do, a Reformed Jew would be more likely to look up the 613 laws and say, well, that's what God was saying back then. What does this mean today? Because some of the rules for Reformed Jews, they'd say they're not appropriate anymore. And actually they should focus on different things and try and find out what God is trying to say today, rather than take some very old rules and force them into a modern context. Here's our man again. Now, we've talked about him a few times now. Rabbi Moses Maimonides. Now, he's a very famous guy in Judaism, and he's one of the people who've compiled a list of the 613 mitzvot. And in the last lesson, we actually very quickly looked through the whole list, and I would recommend you go away and do have a good look at the mitzvot in their entirety. But I just paused it on this slide here just to point out that some of the mitzvot involve the temple. Now, this is slightly problematic today. I don't know what you know about Jerusalem, but in terms of the temple that used to stand there for Jews, it is no longer there. And all that's left is the Western Wall. Now, some Jews would treat the Western Wall still as a very, very holy and precious place. Most do. But in terms of the whole temple, most Jews would say there is no whole temple today. Reformed Jews are different. They might refer to the synagogue as the temple, but we're going to look at that in the next unit when we do Judaism, the practices. But all you need to know for today is that in terms of the mitzvot and the 613, some of them need the temple to be followed. So some of the rules, some of the commandments are dependent on the temple being accessible, and at present it isn't. Now what this means is, logically, a Jew can't follow all 613 mitzvot at the moment because there is no temple. This brings us near to the end of the lesson now. Last set of questions here. Now, one of these questions is a 12-mark question. If you're doing RS GCSE, this will be really, really important to you. You need to get to know how to answer these questions. And in a few lessons' time, what I'll do is I'll do a breakdown of how to have a go at answering this. But for today, just see what you can come up with. All right, pause the video. We'll do the answers in just a second. Okay, let's just have a look at these answers now, and that'll bring us to the end of today. So number 5, explain in simple terms how Reformed Jews differ from Orthodox Jews. So effectively, Orthodox Jews try and keep Judaism intact and unchanged as much as possible. Reformed Jews, on the other hand, will change and tailor Judaism so that it fits their society, their culture in a relevant way. Number 6, how do these two groups interpret the relationship between free will and the mitzvot? Okay, this is not a trickier question. If we start with the Orthodox Jews. So Orthodox Jews think that the purpose of free will is to follow the mitzvot as much as possible. That's the purpose of free will, to follow the mitzvot. Reformed Jews, on the other hand, they would say that the purpose of free will is to interpret the mitzvot and to understand the meaning behind the rules so they can be sure that they're following God's rules in a relevant way today. How can some of the 613 mitzvot not be followed today? Well, the answer to that is because the temple doesn't exist anymore, and some of the mitzvot are dependent on the temple. Our 12 marker was all Jews should follow the mitzvah. This was for you to have a go at trying this format of question out. When you're going to answer one of this, you want to say some Jews think this, other Jews think this, and then bring it all to a conclusion at the bottom. So you might say some Jews would agree that all Jews should follow the mitzvah. You would probably want to bring in the covenant. You would say something like, well, Moses set the covenant up with God, and we know that a covenant can't be broken at any point. And so he made an agreement that all Jews would follow the mitzvah, therefore all Jews must follow the mitzvah. You might also talk about how following the mitzvah leads to a blessed life and a harmonious society and blessings from God. On the other hand, you might say some Jews would disagree and say, no, not all Jews should follow the mitzvah. You might bring in the fact that because of the lack of the temple, some of the mitzvah can't be followed today. You might use the Reformed Jew argument and say, actually, some of the rules, they're not really appropriate or relevant in our society anymore. Okay, that brings us to the end of the lesson. I hope that was helpful. Let's just finish by going to our need to know. You need to know that God has given Jews the mitzvot so they know how to use their God-given free will. And therefore there are rewards and punishments for those who follow it and those who do not. See you next time.